Kerby Anderson. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. In this first hour, we're going to spend some time talking about a new book, which fits very well with the podcast that has the same title. It's called Gospelbound, Living with Resolute Hope in an Anxious Age, and something we've talked about so often here on Point of View. So we're going to spend an hour kind of looking at that. Next hour, we're going to get into all sorts of issues in the news. We'll probably cover everything from climate change to critical race theory to some things happening on university campuses and a variety of other topics, including a fact check. So we're going to get into a lot of topics over the next 2 hours. And if you'd like to join us at any point, you are welcome to do so. 1-800-351-1212. We have information on our website at pointofview.net. And we're going to be talking about this book called Gospelbound, Living with Resolute Hope in an Anxious Age. It is co-authored by Collin Hansen. He is the Vice President of Content as well as the Editor-in-Chief for the Gospel Coalition. If you'd like to know more about the organization, we have a link to that on the website. Of course, you have the Gospel Coalition podcast. You also have the Gospelbound podcast and many others. So I want you to kind of check all of those out. The book here that we're talking about is published by our good friends at Multnomah, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about that as well on our website at pointofview.net, so you can get it both in paperback and in Kindle. So, Collin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Might mention that you also graduated from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, went to Northwestern, and a lot of the information about you and about the podcast is available. But before we get into the book, let's talk about the podcast, because I was telling my producer, I went down this long list of interviews that we have done on this program, and you've interviewed some of the same people on whether it's history, theology, politics, origins, a variety of others. So again, your, if you will, Gospelbound podcast is about as wide-ranging as some of the things we talk about here on Point of View.
That sounds like we're going to get along really well. You know, one of the things I've learned about interviewing over the years is that you can't necessarily know exactly what everybody is going to be interested in, but the best bet is to go with your gut about what you think is interesting. So if you're reading something and you want to know more about it, then people will catch on to that passion. They can tell when we're engaged on those topics. They can tell when we're just sort of checking in. And that's what I do is I find people who are writing some just interesting things and try to talk to them about it. Not always Christians, sometimes non-Christians as well, but I try to model a way of being able to engage them with the gospel and be able to learn from people even when we disagree on some important things.
And speaking of that, I noticed you and I both interviewed Tom Holland on the book Dominion, and of course he doesn't claim to be a Christian. It's just a good example of that. I may get to Andy Crouch in just a minute, because that podcast last year is one that sort of went viral. But again, just to maybe illustrate this, if people would like to know more about that, of course there are a number of different podcasts at the Gospel Coalition, and as I understand it, it doesn't take much to sign up and receive those on a regular basis.
No, just go to thegospelcoalition.org. You can find everything from, we're talking about Gospelbound here, to one of our most popular, Let's Talk, featuring, it's really a lot of Christian living type topics, especially for women. But with the Gospelbound podcast, the premise is really the same as the book. The idea is that in an ever-changing culture, we have to be able to adapt, not our faith, but we have to be able to continue to learn. Like the fundamentals of our faith don't ever change. We have to stand fast with those at all different times. But there are people out there like Tom Holland who are doing some really investigative and creative studies, and they're helping us to understand the backbone of our culture in the West, the good things at least that we love to claim are from Christianity. And so, I think that's why I love doing shows like this, is because it's so interesting to be able to exchange ideas in ways that you just can't do in any other medium. So I'll always love radio, podcasts, and stuff like that, because it just gives you some time to really think and to talk and to process. And it's just a lot of fun that way.
Well, let's give your book some due before we get into all the details, and that is you basically have what are called 7 traits of a gospel-bound Christian. I'm going to have you define that in just a minute, but embracing the future, living with honor, suffering with joy, care for the weak, set another seat at the table, love their enemies, and give away their freedom. And so I thought it was a good way to kind of take all these different stories you collected over this time and put them in some kind of focus. But again, the theme is gospel bound. And for people that have never heard the phrase, can you define it for us?
Well, it's a phrase we kind of invented, so I don't expect everyone to have to kind of be familiar with it. So the beautiful thing about the word bound is that it has multiple meanings for us. And one of the meanings that it has is it both goes backward and forward. And so what it means for us to be Christians who live by the gospel, the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ for sinners, our eternal, the eternal life that we share with God through the blood of Christ and the intercession on our behalf. The beautiful thing about this message is that it is both historical, it's rooted, it's unchanging, and it's really this message, this power of God, is what keeps us from getting blown away with everything that's changing. I'm sure you and I could have a long conversation, but all the different things that we're worried about, all the different things that are changing, all the different things that we're concerned about for our children and for our grandchildren. And so what's our hope in the middle of that? Well, it's this unchanging message of Jesus Christ. It's that, and that is what binds us. The way I think about it is, if this world is a kind of hurricane and it's raging and we're being blown to, this way and that, the gospel is what keeps us steady from getting blown away. And yet at the same time, the gospel, this good news about our future hope, it comes through in passages like Romans 15:13, where we're encouraged to abound in hope. And so with this being bound, we're also leaping forward in that hurricane. We're not just sort of hunkering down. We're actually leaning in to it. We're facing first into it, and we're actually hopeful about things. And I think what the moment calls for with Christians is Christians who are both steadfast, resolute. That's what we talk about in this book.
Right.
Resolute in this culture, and also hopeful at the same time. I think that's the need of our hour.
Yesterday we were even talking about in one of my Sunday school classes about all the different political changes, economic changes. I'm quoting from, the Federal Reserve producing 30% of all the dollars that ever exist on this planet within the last year. What that means, quotes from Victor Davis Hanson about some of the political issues, the first 100 days of Joe Biden, and on and on and on. And then, you say, okay, how do I find hope in that? And it was interesting because our pastor just happened to mention that if you type, when you're sending a text, type the word hope, what pops up as a suggested emoji is 2 fingers crossed, which is not exactly the biblical view of hope. And I thought that was really striking because we're talking about a different kind of hope than, well, I just hope we make our way through this. I just hope I graduate this year. I've heard from some seniors, or I hope I pass this test. So we're talking about, as you talk about, resolute hope. We'll come back, though. I want to talk a little bit about the way you've done this, because you asked your co-author, Sarah, a couple years ago to report news not heard anywhere else. We've kind of done that on Point of View, too. I want to talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When an issue surfaces that the progressive mob doesn't like, you can bet that a few woke corporations will swoop down and act like the fourth branch of government. The election law passed in Georgia is just the most recent example. Corporate influence and interference is now spreading to other states, now considering laws to improve election integrity. Now, you might wonder why the country's corporations don't stop and consider the implications for their companies. Haven't they learned the lesson from other companies that have paid a price in their bottom line for social activism? A few examples are Dick's Sporting Goods, Target Stores, and Gillette. The CEO of Coca-Cola took to the media to voice his displeasure, using a British accent, about the Georgia voting law. Almost immediately, that brought attention to the company doing business in China with oppressive human rights violations. And the CEO of Delta Airlines seems to think that it is racist to require Georgia voters to show an ID when Delta requires every passenger to do so at check-in. Is he the best voice for the oppressed when you consider that he makes more money in one day than the average American makes in a year? Add to that the revelation that Delta has been working with legislative leaders to exclude some controversial proposals and then suddenly jumped into the debate as if this was the first they'd heard of the bill. And have you noticed that corporations never jump into a political debate until they feel they have more to lose by being neutral? They fear the progressive mob, but perhaps it's time for them to fear the moderate and conservative consumer. They also drink soda, fly airplanes, and buy baseball tickets. Most Americans really don't want corporations and companies to take sides, produce the best product or service, and stay out of politics and the culture wars. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Collin Hansen, and he co-authored the book as well with Sarah Zylstra. And I might just mention that one of the things you asked her to do, I guess that's almost 5 years ago now, is to actually write news that wasn't being reported elsewhere. Stories of people caring for the weak, loving their enemies, suffering in the midst of persecution. And we've tried to cover some of those as well. And that, in some respects, illustrates why, as people read through your book, or they listen to your podcast, or frankly, if they listen to some of the stories we do on Point of View, they're going to say, I haven't heard that anywhere else. And that's not a bad thing, because I recognize the mainstream media is not going to cover a lot of Christian stories anyway. And second of all, if there's sort of a bias against Christians, which is certainly something that's no surprise to our listeners, it's really going to be incumbent upon us to cover those kinds of stories, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so you framed it well. We wanted to tell stories that the mainstream media is not going to cover. And I think one reason why Sarah and I feel so strongly about this is because we're both trained journalists. We both graduated from one of the premier journalism schools in this country. We've learned a lot of skills in positive ways. We've also learned how journalists decide what gets included and what doesn't get included with it. But one of the things that we found as Christians is that what we loved about journalism, what we still love about journalism, is a commitment to telling the truth. That's journalism at its best, is being able to tell truth at a time when people, from politicians to corporations to all kinds of different people, don't tell the truth. That's the best. That's the best positive part of it. The negative is that journalists can be incredibly selective about what kind of quote-unquote truth they tell, yes, and how they frame a certain story. And so I'll just give you one example. Gosh, I feel like I could get examples of like this every single day. But one example that I saw today was the Daily Mail out of the United Kingdom, out of Great Britain, reported about a church in Georgia that had disciplined a woman for leaving her husband and leaving her children. Okay, well, you might think, gosh, well, that's a church that's actually willing to stand up and do what is right to be able to protect a husband and protect children from the destructive decisions that their wife and mother had made. Well, of course, what happened in this case is that she's a lesbian. So this became a story where she's the aggrieved victim who just wants to be happy, and how dare a church be this way? This is what we're seeing every single day. But what we talk about in our book is all the stories of our friends, from Rachel Gilson to Sam Alberry to Rebecca McLaughlin to Rosaria Butterfield, who we see as living out the biblical admonition, especially from the book of Romans, to live with honor, not to live for their own selfish pursuits, not to live according to their temptations to sin. All of them experience various forms of same-sex attraction, but do not act on them because they're contrary to God's design. So we tell their stories. We tell their stories how they live with honor and live for God. And those stories are just as legitimate as anything else the media might concoct. But of course, it doesn't fit a certain progressive narrative, and that's why it doesn't get featured. But we as Christians, we've got to fight back. But we don't fight back primarily. What we see in Romans 12 is that we overcome evil with good. Mm-hmm. And those are the stories we tell, where people are overcoming evil with good.
Chapter 3 is, of course, the gospel-bound Christians live with honor. And you talk about the difference between facing in and a story of sexual fulfillment, as well as facing in sexual unfulfillment, and then the idea of facing out, living with sexual honor. And I thought that was a great, if you will, turn of phrase and concept. Can you explain that a little better?
Yeah, so one of the things that people can misunderstand about our current moment is we can imagine that what's happening with sexuality is some sort of aberration that is primarily focused on, say, transgender ideology or identity, or on homosexuality. And those are important factors. But there's actually something underneath all of that. And it's something that all of us, the challenges that we all face, there's an essential notion that we all face in this culture of, if it doesn't feel good, then it can't be right. But that is not what any generation before us would have thought. They would have known that when you're living an honorable life, when you're living for God, when you're living for a higher purpose, when you're living for other people, it means that you have to be able to live. You cannot just depend on your impulses. You cannot just live for yourself. And so one of the last taboos of this culture is that you're not encouraged to, say, abandon your children, because you have a responsibility. You have made a commitment of honor to care for these children that you've brought into this world. At least that's kind of what we're supposed to be. That's still that's a common grace. But when you see that happens in the story that I told you about from Georgia, is our culture says, well, should you care for your children, or should you fulfill your own sexual desires?
Yeah.
Well, the honorable thing to do is to care for those people who depend on you. But that's what it means to live with that sexual honor, is to submit your demands and your desires ultimately to God's plan and to other people that you're supposed to care for.
Let's take another chapter, and we will certainly cover some of them, maybe not all of the 7 chapters, but one is on caring for the weak. Now, that one, for a lot of individuals, matter of fact, we do a millennial roundtable, that'll be Wednesday. It's real easy to talk about sexual trafficking and things of that nature because, who's against sexual trafficking? But it gets a little more difficult when you start talking about serving the poor when it isn't popular. You talk about, of course, it's popular there, or caring for the weak and the poor when the going gets tough or where it gets dangerous. And in some respects, that's what I think sets Christians apart from some that want to make it look like and do a little virtual signaling to say that I care for the poor. But when it really gets down to some of the difficult areas, that's where I think the Christian conviction shines, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. My pastor taught me this lesson many, many, many years ago, and I really learned a lot from him doing ministry in an urban context, a lot of people in different economic situations, things like that. And he said, if you're doing this to make yourself feel good, if you're serving other people to make yourself feel good, then you're going to quickly understand that other people don't exist for that purpose. And a lot of people who are poor, not everybody by any means, but a lot of people who are poor have made some really bad decisions in their lives. They they struggle with certain things like addictions. They're not easy necessarily to help. And so if you come into it thinking, well, the right thing to do is to care for the weak and to care for the poor, and I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to feel good about that, and I'm going to help them, and they're going to be happy about it, and I'm going to be a kind of savior to them. Well, I mean, that for those people who persevere, those Christians who persevere year after year after year after year, caring for people who are homeless, caring for people who are addicted, caring for people in cycles of generational poverty, they don't do this for themselves. Ultimately, they do this for God, because that's what he calls us to do. They do this on the horizon of eternity, not on quick fixes. So at some point, for every Christian who wants to make a difference in this world, you have to realize that you're doing this in many ways for the next, and out of hope in the next world, but not because you expect to get a lot of credit in this world. It's not going to sustain you through the real dark moments of service.
And again, if you think you're going to get credit in this world, you haven't done ministry for a while, because you recognize I can pour my life into individuals and raise them up and help them become self-sufficient, and then they just leave. And you just say, well, Jesus did talk about this. Actually, seeing another about 9 of the 10 lepers just keep it going, and don't even come back to say thank you. And so that's another part of that. If you're doing it for any kind of applause you get in this life, you better start looking at this from a different viewpoint, which means maybe after the break, I want to come back to embracing the future, because that gets us into, if you will, a Christian view of time. And you have a section there on the early Christian view of time, and we can talk about Chronos and Kairos and all that if you want to get real theological, but I think it just gets us into this whole idea of how to see this. And I think that was significant for Sarah, your co-author, because we've gone through quite a year. I'm thinking back to kind of your famous podcast with Andy Crouch. He was saying about this time last year, same thing I was saying. If you think this is going to be a momentary glitch, I'm here to tell you this may last for months or years. And of course, guess what turned out to be the case? We're getting to something that looks a little bit more like normal. I know you live in Alabama, so you probably see something more normal than my listeners in New York and California right now. But nevertheless, let's take a break. We are continuing the conversation after the break with Collin Hansen, and we're talking about this new book, came out this month, Gospelbound, Living with Resolute Hope in an Anxious Age. A number of chapters, but of course, as I just mentioned, 7 traits that really make up a gospel-bound believer. And if you would like to know more, we have information about him, information about the Gospel Coalition, and about the book all on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Collin Hansen. He is the co-author of the book Gospelbound, Living with Resolute Hope in an Anxious Age. It is published by Multnomah. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have quite a bit of information about it on our website, and you can get it in paperback or Kindle. Also, we have a link to the Gospel Coalition. Now, you can either go to our website and find the link, or if you want to go directly to it, make sure it is thegospelcoalition.org, but you don't have to write all that out because we've made it very easy for you to click on the button. And Collin, when people go there, they can get the podcast for the Gospel Coalition, the podcast for Gospelbound, or a number of other podcasts. They can find all sorts of articles, and as far as I can tell, looks like almost all those resources are free. And so, if nothing else, some great resources that we can help educate our listeners about some of the topics you and I talk about on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. All these articles, theological journals, podcasts, videos, all kinds of different things. It's amazing the resources we have available to us today. One of the things we actually just launched at the Gospel Coalition is theological essays on just dozens and dozens and dozens of topics, just answering the basic questions that Christians bring. Another thing we're going to be launching, I think, later this year is biblical commentaries for people to be able to look up, to be able to, for the entire Scripture. It's just, I know there's a lot of things for us to be discouraged about, and we could talk about those things, but what the Internet affords us in terms of access to information to learn about biblical truth is truly unprecedented.
You know, again, when I got started, and I'm the old one around the table, I remember that we didn't have as many things on worldview. We didn't have so many things on apologetics. Yes, we did have a number of commentaries, but they were all kind of locked away in books. Now I carry around on my laptop all sorts of commentaries, all sorts of books, resources, and others, and it's just an embarrassment of riches that we enjoy. But again, we encourage people to read because leaders are readers, and so that is certainly the case. But before we went to the break, I did talk about this idea of time, and I was encouraged to see that actually in one of your chapters, Gospel-Bound Christians Embrace the Future, that it gets into the issue of time. And this is important because, you know, I think I was reading Sarah talking about that, but you do as well, in the book about just the way in which this pandemic, the lockdown, the uncertainty, the race riots, and everything else, if you just focus on our moment and don't see that in the sense of history, and certainly don't see that in light of eternity, there is just no way you won't be depressed. But if you begin to understand your place and the view, which I would say would be a biblical view of time that were held by the early Christians, that's going to help you be much more effective and maybe not fall into some of those traps of psychological despair and depression.
Yeah, that Christianity it's a movement, it's a belief, it's a religion of these two different perspectives on time. And it's really what we're talking about here with Gospelbound. It's the sense in which we are believers in a historic resurrection, in a historic Jesus. We're looking back on things. These are things that actually happened. 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul reminds us that if these things didn't happen, then our faith is in vain. This is really what sets Christianity apart in so many different ways as a religion. And at the same time, we're not living in the past. Jesus tells us ultimately that faithfulness looks like us living in the moment, because tomorrow, at least here on this world, is not promised to us. When you think about the early church, how were they sustained? Well, of course, in part, they were sustained because of their belief in these historic facts about Jesus and the risen Lord, but also it's because they had an assurance of things hoped for. This firm belief in the things not seen, and that's, of course, the life to come. The return of Christ someday, the new heavens and the new earth, and our dwelling in heaven with Christ himself. And that's what sustains you in the midst of persecution. We often hear, especially from the early church leader Tertullian, that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And I guess maybe you could have convinced the early church that what you guys are really doing here to sacrifice yourselves is going to pay off. But that wasn't some kind of strategy. It was simply their living and abiding hope to say, I may lose my family in some ways. I may lose respect. I may actually even lose my life. But I know what's going to come. I'm going to see Christ face to face. And therefore, the world really can't do anything to me except hasten that day when my faith becomes sight. And if Christians have that perspective, I think it really transforms how we live in the day-to-day. And I think we can do that right now. I think that could be the seeds of a revival in our time. It's not an obsession with the headlines that unfortunately are very discouraging in many times, but an obsession with God's word and an obsession with our imminent hope in Christ's return and our eternal dwelling with him. That's what I think a Christian view of time looks like.
And again, a great setup for your chapter on Gospelbound Christians Suffer with Joy. And your co-author, Sarah, wrote about that. But it fits very well with, in 2 Corinthians 4, you think of the Apostle Paul saying, we do not lose heart. And he talks about this idea of light and momentary affliction preparing for us an eternal weight of glory. I love the weight of glory because that's, of course, a C.S. Lewis allusion as well. But in some respects, that chapter that you have in your book about persecution, you begin to see that because you understand that from eternity's point of view, what seems so heavy and burdensome and grievous, really from an eternal perspective, will seem like light and momentary affliction.
Yeah, Sarah had an opportunity to be able to travel right before COVID had hit. Meet with a number of Chinese Christian leaders, and these are people whose family, whose friends have been jailed, whose churches have been closed down. Of course, they face the pandemic on the midst of all these different things. In fact, we've run at the Gospelcoalition.org. We've published a report on the effect of the church, and really the Chinese government has used COVID-19 as a kind of a premise to be able to shut down a lot more churches and to more control, tighten the controls there. But what Sarah didn't see from these Chinese pastors was a despair. She also didn't see from them some kind of grand strategy. Yeah, we've got everything figured out. This is how we're going to grow the church here. No, it was a simple matter of faithfulness. And I keep going back to what Jesus told us to expect. I keep going back to John 16:33, where Jesus tells us, in this world you will have much tribulation, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And it's kind of funny to think about that, because in what sense has Jesus overcome the world when the Chinese Communist Party is still in control, of a billion people in this world? In what sense has he overcome? Well, he's overcome in a way that brings us joy in the long term, because we know, if we know anything from the Bible and from history, it's that kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall, except for the kingdom of God, which lasts forever. So in many ways, it's just simply logical to say that these afflictions are light and momentary because they're nothing compared to eternity. And I think we get into a lot of trouble as Christians when we expect too much from this world. The theologians would call that an over-realized eschatology. And I'd simply say that sometimes what we need to do as Christians to be able to find more joy in our lives is to recalibrate our expectations of what this life is meant to do physically, circumstantially, and recalibrate on these promises of God that no one and nothing can take away from us.
Well, let's see if we can take a break. But when we come back, I want you to put your political hat on for just a minute. I mean, after all, you actually went to Capitol Hill and spent some time there as well. And one of your chapters is about gospel-bound Christians love their enemies. And I was thinking about, even as we were going into that chapter, of an interview I did a while back with Arthur Brooks. And he wrote this book, Love Your Enemies, How Decent People Can Save America from a a culture of contempt. I was also thinking of an interview we did with Jonathan Haidt on coddling of the American mind. And you've got a chart there, which I think we even talked about with David French as well. As partisan divides over political values widen, other gaps remain modest. And so you can see that we oftentimes are being told how divided we are by age and gender and race and those kinds of things. I'm not minimizing that. We've certainly been through that. But the real big division was between Republicans and Democrats in the political parties. And one of the things that Arthur Brooks shared with us is about how we've just almost cultivated a culture of contempt. And Senator Ben Sasse has written about this and so many other people. So I want to come back and talk about that chapter on Love Your Enemies, and we will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes as we continue our conversation with Collin Hansen, as we talk about another one of those traits of an individual that is gospel-bound. Gospel-bound Christians love their enemies. That is a lesson we need to learn right now. First of all, to be loving of those with whom we disagree. And second of all, if I could add something as well, just maybe the courage to stand for truth. I mean, I'm thinking of Rod Dreyer's book, Live Not by Lies. And there is just a real pressure right right now to, first of all, support your own tribe, to vilify the other tribe, but then the other tribe sometimes even forces you to say things that aren't true. And it seems to me that if anything, we need to come back to first principles, whether it's the Good Samaritan or speaking the truth in love or whatever illustration you want to use from the New Testament. We need that message now more than ever, don't we?
Yeah, I wrote a book a few years ago called Blind Spots, Becoming a Courageous, Compassionate, and Commissioned Church. And the thing that stood out to me in that context was that so many of us as Christians are tempted to define ourselves, to build our identity on how we're different from others, or really how we're better than others. And simply, we can feel good about ourselves just because we're not as bad as someone else.
Yes.
And, it really is Arthur Brooks. You mentioned him before the break. He's the one who taught me so much on this, because he said, politics is what happens when groups of people stand up and somebody says, you people right here, you people are so beautiful. You're so perfect. You're so wonderful. The problem with everything in this world is all those people out there, all those people who are screwing everything up for you beautiful people right here. And he said the church at its worst does something similar. But the church at its best does the opposite. The church says, we're all sinners in here who desperately need grace. No one could need more grace than we do. We understand that we have nothing apart from Christ, but we have everything in Christ, including the ability to be able to love people who are different from us, even the people who threaten us, even the people who are working against us. We can love them because, remember from Romans 12, remember from Jesus' own example in his own life, we overcome evil with good. We do not we do not fight evil with evil. That's what it means to be a Christian. And so absolutely, that's exactly, we orient ourselves not toward just being better than those other bad people. No. We orient ourselves toward truth. We orient it toward Christ himself. And like you said from Roger Aird's book, we live not by lies. We live for that eternal truth.
One other mention, I did talk about Jonathan Haidt. You, of course, have a section in there about him. It's nice to meet somebody else that's actually read his book, The Righteous Mind. So, because
one of my favorites.
And I pointed out to even some of my colleagues around the table here that it illustrates, one of his studies in the back illustrates that oftentimes Christians, in many cases, know and understand non-Christians better than non-Christians understand them. Conservatives tend to understand liberals better than liberals understand them. And part of that is because even if we tend to be in our own silo, our own tribe, still have to live in a world where you open up the New York Times, Washington Post, you turn on the local television station, you go to the national news, or even go out on the internet. It's pretty much more secular, and it's pretty more liberal. And so as a result, you sort of have to at least understand their world a little bit. But at the same time, his own, if you will, spiritual pilgrimage as an individual, I think you accurately describe him as ethnically Jewish, but basically an atheist. Still, it was a wonderful interview with him because in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, co-authored it with a Christian, and recognized that really we've got some significant problems and divisions in this world. And I think it's going to be incumbent upon Christians to do their best to build some bridges, while the other side is oftentimes building barriers, because that's the only way we're ever going to get anything that looks like harmony or unity within this country. Don't you think?
Yeah, I was editing an article that's coming this week, so I'm giving a little preview for your listeners. The Gospel Coalition is by a sociologist named George Yancey. He's a strong Christian believer.
We know him, sure, yeah.
Oh, great, yeah, African-American, and he's
used
got
to be
a
at
study
North
coming
Texas,
out
now Baylor, yeah, right.
There you go, right, exactly. So I'm sure you're going to want to interview him about his next book coming out, but he does a study of kind of the intersection between Christian theological beliefs and then the political party system. And one of his key takeaways is that for all of the emphasis on conservative Christians and their politics, it's actually progressive Christians who are much more politically oriented. And he said what's fascinating is that progressive Christians in many ways feel more kinship with non-Christians who share their political views than they do with Christians who share their theological views. And he says for conservative Christians, it's actually a different story. For conservative Christians, they actually prioritize the theological, and they have more tolerance for the political differences. Now, I'm sure that's going to come across as controversial to people, but I don't know about you. That perfectly aligns with my experience of what I've seen as well. I mean, coming up like I did through journalism, graduating from Northwestern, living in places like Chicago, I've always had to learn how to prioritize my theological beliefs with other Christians, keep those paramount, be able to work with people across the political spectrum, and being able to find out how to get along with people. But if you're in a lot of the more progressive institutions today, you don't actually ever have to find somebody who disagrees with you politically.
Right.
Or it's left, or it's super left, or super, super left. Those are your varieties there. And so you can go through this in society in a lot of different ways, but I would say as Christians, let's use this to our benefit here. Just like Jonathan Haidt's saying, there's an advantage of being able to say, I actually am better at being able to understand other people and even care for them, and even try to help teach them certain things out of love. And so I don't see it as a weapon to defeat other people, because ultimately as Christians, we defeat other people only when we persuade them of the truth of the gospel. We don't defeat them. We're not trying to just defeat them in some sort of political ballot box. We're trying to win them to the Lord. And so that's one reason I've interviewed Jonathan Haidt a couple different times. Sarah's interviewed him before. He's just one of the most helpful cultural commentators today because of that common grace, even if he doesn't yet believe in Jesus, still holding out for that.
We will certainly do that. Let me just, before I let you go, talk about the fact that we have a link to thegospelcoalition.org, and that is a place where you're going to find some of those articles, including the one that you're working on right now. And so there's some great resources. You can then click on the button there that says podcast, and you've got the Gospel Coalition podcast, and then the question and answer one, the Let's Talk, the Gospelbound one, Help Me Teach the Bible by Nancy Guthrie, and a variety of others. So there's all sorts of resources, editorials, articles, and other materials. So it's all available at our website, but you can also go to thegospelcoalition.org. If you'd like to know more about the book, I suspect you'll be able to find it in a local bookstore, but if not, we've, since it just came out, also have a link so you can get it in paperback and Kindle. And Collin, it's been great to have you on the program, and let's do this again sometime.
I would love that. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Well, let's take a break, and while we do so, let me just mention there are all sorts of great resources that we have posted on the website. When we come back, okay, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. The Supreme Court announced that it's going to look at a gun rights case, so we'll talk about this. There are some things being said right now about critical race theory and what's happening in terms of the administration. A couple of good pieces of news I want to share with you, and some fact check that went the wrong way. So we have a lot to cover, and I hope you'll join us in the next hour. But we need to take a break. Take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net, find what you need, and we'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to get back into issues in the news, and we'll talk about a couple of things. First of all, one that I did not put on the schedule, but has just been announced, that the Supreme Court is actually going to look at a gun rights case, and so we'll get into that in just a minute. What about this issue of the Second Amendment? This was a case which before was not taken by the Supreme Court when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was on the court, but it has now been taken. Maybe that's Amy Coney Barrett, but I think it's some other things as well, in terms of the fact that there are people looking at some of these executive orders coming down from President Biden. So we'll talk about that for just a minute. One of my articles talks about how critical race theory is really moving into a school district near you. So we're going to talk about that for sure. I assume we'll have some time to also talk about this issue of climate change and what the president wants to do through his climate summit. Now, as a program note, let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to have George Barna with us. We'll talk about the fact that a lot of Christians maybe are saved, but they don't have a biblical worldview. Second hour, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking with Calvin Beisner, because he's been looking at this whole issue of climate change, and in particular, what some of these goals by the president could actually do to our economy and to the world. So we'll cover some of that as well. Might just mention as well, we have an article about how a number of universities are starting to think about eliminating their sports program. A lot of them have cut back already, and we'll see where that takes us. And then we have a fact check that was done on Senator Tim Scott that I think was so unfair and dishonest that it's worth a mention. So we'll try to cover all of that this hour. If not, we'll get to it tomorrow, and those will be topics we will address. We'll have a Millennial Roundtable this Wednesday. Thursday, we have Jim Dennison with us. We've just got lots to cover. But I thought before I get into some of the news, let's start with some good news. And this is good news around the world. Jonah Goldberg got my attention about this the other day, in which he pointed out in his piece that we look like we now have a vaccine for malaria. Now, you might say, well, I've never met anybody that's died from malaria. Well, then you maybe have never traveled overseas, because there was an article came out a while back, I think it was in Science, that people now question, but at that time they were making the case that half of the people that have ever died from malaria. And some people think maybe that's a little bit overdone, but it's just barely, because if you want to talk about a disease that has devastated humanity, and one that really has even had an influence in the political realm, that is the case. And part of the reason we even are dealing with something like sickle cell anemia, it's quite possible, if you've ever had a genetics course, unfortunately, very few journalists point that out because they don't take classes in genetics, I guess, is that if you inherit one sickle cell gene, that actually gives you some protection against malaria. But of course, if you get both of those genes, you die of sickle cell anemia. And there have been people that have pointed out that the impact of malaria, for example, on colonization of Africa, it was much easier for the British to take South Africa, but the middle parts of Africa where malaria was the case, certainly not the case. You go all the way back in ancient times, there are many people that believe that Rome for a while survived, if for no other reason than because surrounding Rome were all these swamps which were infested with mosquitoes that had malaria, and it was sort of almost a biodefense system against some of these foreign invaders. Let's come back to our country. I did not know this until I read it the other day. You ever heard of the Mason-Dixon line? Well, it turns out that the Mason-Dixon line was, I thought, in some respects, suggestive of, the difference between slavery in the South and freedom in the North. Yes, but it also turns out that it was two different areas in terms of temperature. And so as a result, if you were below the Mason-Dixon line, much more likely to get some things like malaria, less likely northern of that as well. And so European indentured servants that were there, as well as Native American slaves, were more likely to die from the disease, because malaria was basically brought here from the other countries by the Europeans. And so that was another significant factor as well. And once we began to drain the swamps and wetlands and things like that, malaria simply went away. But then when you had, I don't need to go into all the details here. When Rachel Carson wrote her Silent Spring, they wanted to start getting rid of DDT, and so then malaria began to rise its ugly and deathly head once again in Africa. So nevertheless, this is another example of some of the research that was done, because that same team that developed the vaccine for COVID-19, the one in Oxford that developed AstraZeneca, has now developed this first vaccine against malaria. It appears from the World Health Organization that it has a 75% efficacy. And as I've said before, if you have ever interacted with people that have come here from Africa, if you've ever gone to Africa, you know how even to this day malaria has devastated our societies over there, and certainly have devastated the world's population. So I thought I'd start out with some good news, and it illustrates again this world that we find ourselves in. Remember when we talked about Operation Warp Speed developing a vaccine in less than a year. I even have a commentary talking about the fact, I think it's coming out this week, in which this vaccine was not developed in 10 years or 5 years. It was developed in less than a year, and now it looks like we have a vaccine against malaria. That's really good news. Let's just, before we take a break, mention that the Supreme Court has now decided that it will hear a gun rights case. This, I think, illustrates the fact that maybe now the Chief Justice, John Roberts, can't necessarily push those gun rights cases aside as he was willing to do. You have a 6-3 conservative majority there with the addition of the Associate Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And this is the same court that when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was there, did not. Now, again, all you need to know is you need 4 justices to take a case and 5 to win. And so this has to do with a case out of New York, where you have a gun permit law that makes it almost impossible to have concealed carry. That may be an overstatement, but it's my quick analysis of that law, and I want to get into more detail before the court considers the case. But the case is going to look at the state's denial of a petitioner's application for concealed carry licenses for self-defense that were denied there in New York. And so, if nothing else, you can see that, as we've talked about before, elections have consequences, because 3 of the justices on the Supreme Court came from Donald Trump. By the way, I've got a piece coming out tomorrow which has the inviting title, Elections Have Consequences, Cheating Does Not, because it's getting into the attempt to try to change all the election laws. But nevertheless, there is some indication now that the Supreme Court may actually address this issue of the Second Amendment in a way that would affect some of these laws that are very restrictive in a state like New York. And if you've ever been, as I have, to Vermont, when you travel from Vermont into New York, there is actually a sign warning you that, yes, you have a gun-free zone pretty much in Vermont, but now you have a gun-restricted zone in New York. And so we'll see how that plays out when the Supreme Court meets. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, when an issue surfaces that the progressive mob doesn't like, you can bet that a few woke corporations will swoop down and act like the fourth branch of government. The election law passed in Georgia is just the most recent example. Corporate influence and interference is now spreading to other states, now considering laws to improve election integrity. Now, you might wonder why the country's corporations don't stop and consider the implications for their companies. Haven't they learned the lesson from other companies that have paid a price in their bottom line for social activism? A few examples are Dick's Sporting Goods, Target Stores, and Gillette. The CEO of Coca-Cola took to the media to voice his displeasure, using a British accent, about the Georgia voting law. Almost immediately, that brought attention to the company doing business in China with oppressive human rights violations. And the CEO of Delta Airlines seems to think that it is racist to require Georgia voters to show an ID when Delta requires every passenger to do so at check-in. Is he the best voice for the oppressed when you consider that he makes more money in one day than the average American makes in a year? Add to that the revelation that Delta has been working with legislative leaders to exclude some controversial proposals, and then suddenly jumped into the debate as if this was the first they'd heard of the bill. And have you noticed that corporations never jump into a political debate until they feel they have more to lose by being neutral? They fear the progressive mob, but perhaps it's time for them to fear the moderate and conservative consumer. They also drink soda, fly airplanes, and buy baseball tickets. Most Americans really don't want corporations and companies to take sides, produce the best product or service, and stay out of politics and the culture wars. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me, if I can, for just a few minutes, talk about this idea of critical race theory and try to describe it for just a little bit, because sometimes we talk about this and you go, I'm not sure what this is. And I've actually seen some people writing some commentaries in which they say, you may not even know what critical race theory is, but it's coming to a school district near you and you need to know about that. So I want to try to explain why that's in the news right now. And again, it may be an action item that we will create. But if you'd like to ask some questions, again, you are free to do so. Matter of fact, maybe you have some comments already about the Second Amendment or many of the other issues we're going to get into. Feel free to give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. What we first of all are seeing is that there has been a bill before Congress right now, which some people have been warning. Stanley Kurt's probably the best example of a person who's been warning that what's called the Civics Secure Democracy Act could actually be used to promote critical race theory. And some people have said, well, maybe you're overreacting to that. Well, now we don't have to, because we just saw the other day that a proposal that came from President Biden's Department of Education will actually prioritize applications that reduce down to some of the key issues of critical race theory, which brings me, first of all, to try to explain what that is. For those of you that maybe get the Imprimis newsletter from Hillsdale College, we've never really promoted it here, but it is available to people free of charge, and I get it, and I'm sure a lot of you get it, because 5.5 million people get it free every month. Now, I do send money into Hillsdale because I think very highly of the organization as well as of the college, but The most recent issue, which is actually a March issue that just arrived here in April, is by Christopher Rufo. We mentioned him on Friday. Penedexter had read this Primus. I had as well. And he points out that critical race theory is a type of Marxism. But let me try to explain, because the original ideas of Karl Marx were that there would be if you will, a revolution that would develop between the capitalists and the workers, and that there would be this class conflict. And so eventually the workers would gain some kind of social consciousness. They'd see their plight. They would complain about the fact that the capitalists were getting the money and they were doing the work. They would seize the means of production. They would overthrow the capitalist class, and they would bring in a type of socialism, which eventually, as this would change the economic base, change the cultural superstructure, eventually it would evolve into mature communism. Well, that didn't quite work out because, as many people are well aware, the sad history of Marxism in the 20th century, and even this piece here reminds us, the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, Cuba, Vietnam, just go through the list, was just an incredibly brutal time. And so as a result, there were other Marxist scholars that began to say, maybe we need to kind of refashion this Marxism, not around class, but around race. And so they sort of abandoned this sort of dialectic between the capitalists and the workers, substituted race for class, and then tried to develop a coalition of all the people that are displaced and dispossessed. And so that's kind of where you are today. Now, if you say, well, how do I recognize whether or not critical race theory has come to my children or grandchildren's school district? Let me give you a couple of key words. Equity. By the way, equity does not mean equality, and we've already heard this president talking about equity, the idea of social justice rather than biblical justice. Of course, you hear comments about diversity and inclusion, but it's not really diversity of viewpoint, it's diversity in terms of race. And one of the key words or phrases that you need to pay attention to is, it sounds pretty, equity sounds pretty good. The other one is culturally responsive teaching. Well, let me come back to this pronouncement that came from Joe Biden's Department of Education, in which they said that now they would actually give a priority to any individuals applying to support the development of culturally responsive teaching and learning. Oh, there you go. Critical race theory, of course. And so when you start hearing words like equity and cultural responsive, these are key, if you will, buzzwords for critical race theory. And so that gives you a little bit of an idea. Well, let's, if we can now, just also talk about how it's starting to arrive in the schools, because what we're starting to find out is many of these school districts actually are implementing it in a way that you as a parent or a grandparent may not necessarily be aware of. Let me give you a couple of examples. We have listeners in California. So let me use this elementary school where they forced the first graders to deconstruct their racial and sexual identities and then rank themselves according to their power and privilege. So there's one good example right there. I think that was actually in Cupertino. Gives you a good example of that right there. We have listeners in Missouri. This one out of Springfield, Missouri. I've been there before, and that's where a middle school wanted teachers to actually locate themselves on what's called an oppression matrix, which was really, in a sense, based on the idea that white Christian males were members of an oppressive class. And so then you have those kinds of things. And you also had to atone for your privilege and white supremacy. Okay, we have listeners in Pennsylvania. Let me do that one there. Elementary school there forced fifth graders to celebrate what's called black communism. They go, what is that? Well, again, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, so I know that only so well because it's the idea of black power, which goes all the way back to the 1960s of Angela Davis and those kinds of individuals. We have, I think we have some listeners up in Washington, so let's pick this one out of Seattle. You can see I'm just giving you just a few of examples. There you had school district there, which actually told white teachers that they're guilty of, I love this, spirit murder against their black children and must bankrupt their privilege in acknowledgement of their thieved inheritance. Well, I can go on, but I think you can kind of get the idea. And this comes from, again, Christopher Rufo. He says, look, I'm just one investigative journalist, and yet I've developed a database of more than 1,000 of these stories that he's been able to document. And I've heard him do some interviews in which he talks about the database which is there. And then he reminds us, and I wanted to remind you that, you know, when you think about this, this has been kind of an issue because the FBI and some of the other departments, Treasury Department and others, have actually been holding seminars where they've been teaching critical race theory in the government. The FBI, for example, had workshops on intersectionality. Department of Homeland Security were telling white employees that they were committing micro inequities and being socialized into oppressive roles. Treasury Department held training sessions telling staff members that virtually all white people, this is a quote by the way, virtually all white people contribute to racism. They must convert everyone in the federal government. And so it kind of brings us back to something that we have talked about on this program. You might remember that when all these things began to surface about this time last year, President Donald Trump did what? Well, he issued an executive order banning the teaching of critical race theory training in the federal government. What did President Joe Biden do the first day he came into office? He actually signed an executive order rescinding the previous order on that day. And now as we start looking at some of these regulations are really, in a sense, being used to promote them into the schools. So we're probably going to be doing some programs on this. And if you go back to our website, pointofview.net, you'll know that we've even talked about some of the issues associated with that. We've had, for example, Dr. Doug Groteis on to just sort of analyze how critical race theory is taught, because he pointed out that there is a sense in which the critical race theorists have written it in such a way where some people refer to it as a mousetrap. In other words, if you come up with an argument against their theory, well, they'll say your argument doesn't have any weight because you're giving that argument from what we've already assumed to be a systemic racism. And so it's almost impossible to refute the argument. And if nothing else, there's going to be, I think, a need for us to really know how to make the case against this idea of critical race theory, because it is being promoted first in a piece of legislation that may or may not pass from Congress, and second of all from executive orders and regulations coming out from the Biden administration. So again, one of the articles we've posted here actually comes from the New York Post, which is by Stanley Kurtz, about what is happening in your school district, and it's the second article, and it's one I encourage you to read and pass on to everyone in your community. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's start this segment with a question. Is it time to get rid of college athletics? If you think I'm making this up, you need to look at the third article that we've posted here today. We don't talk a lot about sports here on Point of View, but every once in a while it's worth a mention. I recognize that there's maybe too much of a sports obsession in our country, but at the same time, I recognize that athletics at any level oftentimes teach teamwork and unity and a variety of other things and help young people really develop their skills. But at the college level, there are more and more universities now that are saying adios, sayonara, ciao, because they're just simply sending them away. And this second article, or third article here in the second paragraph, talks about that dozens of universities, including Brown University, Michigan State, William and Mary, Iowa, George Washington, to mention just a few in this article, have abruptly eliminated scores of athletic teams this year in sports, including swimming, tennis, gymnastics, lacrosse, rowing, wrestling, and track and field. And hundreds of other sports are apparently on the chopping block as well, according to Greg Dumas. He's entitled this, When the Faculty Lounge Goes Against College Sports. And the decisions, he says, usually come from hand-wringing about budget woes, COVID challenges, fundraising shortfalls, necessitating painful cuts. But he says the reality is far simpler. Many administrators have always looked down on college sports. And he gives you a couple of good quotes from that. One respondent, for example, said, there's too much identification of a university with non-academic aspects, distracting from the values of higher education and from desirable values in society. I mean, if you're in the faculty lounge of a university and you are talking about critical race theory, maybe you're doing engineering, maybe you're talking about business, maybe English literature, whatever it might be, you're going, I don't have any interest at all in this university being identified by the football team or the basketball team in the Final Four or something like that. One professor from Columbia in an article for Atlantic said, quote, admitting too many athletes, he insisted, means denying admissions to future artists and writers and political scientists and economists, which deprives these universities of the greatest possible diversity of students. By the way, that tends not to be the case. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. But what I think is so interesting is the one that sort of started this whole conversation, not that these other universities aren't really relevant, but the one that really has, in a sense, put this whole discussion about getting rid of college athletics on the map has been Stanford University. And its president and the school announced that it would be cutting 11 varsity sports, most of which have produced multiple Olympic champions. And the reason from the school, you got to see this one, just can't even be said with a straight face, Stanford can't afford it. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about college endowments. The largest endowment of any university is Harvard. Second largest endowment is Yale. What is third? Well, that would be Stanford University, okay? And it counts amongst its alumni some of the wealthiest people in the world, okay? Are you with me on this? And so even saying this with a bit of a straight face is hard for me to even imagine. But let me take on one of the arguments in this article. It's 3 pages. I won't go into it, but I just wanted you to at least hear it here first. I think there's going to be a continual drumbeat for more and more removal of athletics from colleges. And I think in one of the last paragraphs, Greg Dumas actually says the claims about cuts being necessary to diversify the student population also turn out to be bunk also. For a start, athletics has been long recognized as a bridge builder to underserved communities. You think? And many of these teams are already far more diverse than their overall student population. And of course, he gives you some examples just from Stanford and others, but think about the number of African Americans sometimes in sports like I don't know, maybe it could be football or basketball. Think of the number of Hispanic Americans in soccer. Think of of course, the number of women that are women athletes. The diversity that we're talking about here is in some respects encouraged and even accentuated by athletics. And so, if nothing else, wanted you to be aware of that particular article that we've posted. I won't say much more about it, but if you are interested in college athletics, if you like to follow your college team, those days may be numbered, at least at some of those universities. Let me now get into this issue of climate change. We'll cover some more of this tomorrow with Calvin Beisner. But it is important to recognize that there are two different ways right now that the Biden administration is pushing forward attempts to address the issue of climate. One is through this piece of legislation, which is called an infrastructure funding bill, which is at about $2.3 trillion. And the argument that many people are making is that only 6% of it deals with infrastructure. I think that's not necessarily fair, because if you look at other things, bridges and roads and things that have to do with maintenance, you can get that number up to maybe 24%. But most of it has to do with what is Green New Deal without calling it the Green New Deal. But don't take my word for it. Who has been promoting the Green New Deal? Well, that would be Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC. And she actually says that she was lamenting that some parts of her party try to avoid saying Green New Deal and try to dance around it. But when she looks at this bill, she says the framework, I think, has been adopted. And again, some of it deals with infrastructure, but more than half of it, at least many people looking at that bill, say that it is focused on trying to find ways to reduce CO2 by eliminating fossil fuels and investing in green investments. So the first way in which you're seeing this being pushed forward, the so-called Green New Deal, is through this bill. The second has to do with the various proposals that President Biden announced on Friday and Saturday, primarily at his Earth Summit. And one of the things he pledged to do was to cut greenhouse gas emissions by half by the end of the decade, to reach a goal ultimately of carbon zero by 2050. Now, one of the things that I am going to post next week, and I already sort of have mentioned it already, is in one of my commentaries, I point out that David Harsanyi at National Review refers to this as Biden's climate denialism. Because you always know that if you have questions about this idea of the Green New Deal, well, then you're a climate change denier. But he uses it in a different way. That is just the denialism of the fact that it's going to require an enormous amount of activity, policy changes and everything to even come close to meeting just the first goal of trying to cut carbon emissions and greenhouse emissions by the end of this decade. For example, most of the energy we get, 80%, comes from fossil fuels or nuclear. Fossil fuels are seen as evil. Nuclear is seen that as well. So only about 20% comes from renewable sources like wind, solar, and hydropower. Actually, solar is only about 3% of that. So you can see that most of it has to still be developed. And so it illustrates that you're just not going to reach these goals by walking a little bit more, riding a bicycle, turning down your thermostat. We're talking about eliminating gas-powered cars, retrofitting homes and buildings, rebuilding the nation's electrical structure and the electrical grid. And to put this in perspective, we last year actually saw a reduction in our greenhouse emissions simply because we had the lockdown. But, David Harsanyi says it's at 13%, but I'm going to quote from another individual who you need to hear from more often, Bill Gates. We don't agree with Bill Gates, but he only says we only reduced it by 5%. Well, whether you accept it's 5% or 10%, 50% is a whole lot more than what we went through, and I think it illustrates the point. And finally, if you just look at what has been happening, the United States and Europe have been reducing the number of greenhouse greenhouse emissions significantly, but it almost doesn't make any difference because those are swamped by all the greenhouse emissions coming from China, and they also are building more coal-fired plants every day. So the first point I want to put on the table is what you might call climate denialism. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about the other issue, and that's what I call climate confusion. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just again come back to this idea of climate change, and we're going to spend more time tomorrow talking about that with Calvin Beisner. But again, just a minute ago, I talked about the fact that some people have come up with this idea of what you might call climate denialism, denying the incredible amount of cost, and both in time, effort, and resources that are going to be required. And this is why you have to make the case that this is such a existential threat that we have to be willing to put up with some of these draconian measures. But there's another part of that, which I've sort of coined another term, and that is not only climate denialism, but climate confusion. And that is, I think you could make the case that, okay, let's assume that we do want to reduce carbon dioxide and we want to reduce emissions. And I'll just concede the point to make the case that we're focusing on the wrong things. from him? Well, because he's written this book called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And even though he's a climate change activist for sure, he nevertheless helps us understand that if you're really wanting to address this issue of carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases, right now, everybody's focusing on the wrong areas. And he has chapters talking about getting around and keeping warm and cool. Getting around, for example, is important, but it is interesting that if nothing else, you really need to focus on the chapter called Making Things. What does that mean? Well, we produce a third of all the greenhouse gases come from making things like cement, steel, and plastics. It has nothing to do with whether or not you ride a bicycle or whether or not you where you put your thermostat. It has to do with steel. Now, to get steel, well, you have to have carbon, just the right amount of carbon. 1 ton of steel produces 1.8 tons of carbon. Cement. Well, in order to have cement, you need calcium from limestone, which has carbon. And so 1 ton of cement emits 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And if you talk about plastics, I think you already know this, plastics come from things like carbon, like oil and other fossil fuels. So you can begin to see that focusing on making things, that's, 1/3 of it, and that has nothing to do with whether or not you put solar panels on your house. One more, and then I'll take a phone call. What he calls plugging in, that would be electrical generation. That accounts again for another 27%. So now you're almost about 3/4 coming from that. And again, that comes from almost 2/3 of the electricity comes from fossil fuels. Yes, you can get carbon-free electricity from nuclear power, but again, the environmental activists oppose that form of energy. So the point I'm making here is that so often they make it sound like, well, we just drive some electric cars and we just turn our thermostat down, we can actually begin to reduce carbon emissions by half. No, a lot of it is completely out of your hands. It has to do with, are we going to continue making steel in this country? I think so. Are we going to continue using and making concrete and building roads? Of course we are, and especially in places like China, India, and all over the African continent. So that's where the real significant changes need to take place. But let me take some phone calls as well. We'll go out to the state of Georgia and the Good News Network. David, what would you like to add to our conversation? Do we have David on the line?
How many?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah, you're on.
Are you there? Okay, thanks, Kerby. I just wondered, how many years does it take to recoup the cost of the energy it takes to make these solar panels and these windmills? They are no small feat to make, and they require a lot of energy to produce them.
They do.
I wonder how long it is before you even break even.
And if you add up all of that, your point is well taken. And that's, again, where even though Bill Gates is really trying to promote this idea of avoiding a climate disaster, a climate crisis, he is very honest about the fact, because he's looked at this from the investments that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation put into it, of the rare earths that you need for some of these batteries, including all these electric cars we're supposedly going to build, and just the incredible amount of fine-tuning that needs to take place in terms of wind turbines, and then the fact that after a period of time you have to retire them, and that begins to be a problem because you can't recycle some of those. So these costs are much greater than some of these politicians who have no real understanding of some of the complexity is there. So you're right, it would take even more time to begin to break even on things like wind and solar in terms of solar panels and the rest. So you're raising some really good questions.
Just the welding, the forging of the metal, even to recycle one of these things. Look how much energy it requires to melt that back down.
You got a good point.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. All right.
Again, we had a little trouble getting that one connection there, but if nothing else, David, you are right on target. And that's why from time to time I like to quote from, in this case, environmental activists to illustrate that even they recognize these are significant challenges. And as I said just a minute ago, you've got a president who maybe is engaged in a different kind of denialism, denying really, if you will, the incredible cost and some of the focus is on the wrong place, so I call that climate confusion. And so all of that is really significant and needs to be factored in. And if you're going to have some conversations, let's have some conversations with a level of common sense. Just before we go, the fourth article is one that I just thought I would mention real quickly. Those of you in the state of South Carolina, of course, know Senator Tim Scott. And the other day, the Washington Post did a fact check on Tim Scott. Now, I was struck by the fact that the fact check came out the day they were announcing that on Wednesday, after President Biden speaks, there will be a response from the Republicans by Tim Scott. So isn't it interesting that you got a hit piece against Senator Tim Scott just as it was announced that he was going to respond? But this fact check really challenged the story that Tim Scott talks about his grandfather, who actually, according to Tim Scott, had to drop out of school in the third grade and actually pick cotton, never learned to read and write. And so as a result, we went from cotton to Congress in 2 generations. Well, the argument that Glenn Kessler used is, well, I checked on this, and it turns out that Artis Ware dropped out in the 4th grade. Okay, 3rd grade, 4th grade, maybe Artis forgot that he actually dropped out in the 4th grade and 3rd grade. And then sort of glossed over the fact that Ware worked 55 hours a week in cotton fields at a young age. And then said, well, I don't know, maybe he could read and write, but he did sign his name on a 1942 World War II draft registration card. Excuse me? Yeah, I'm sure he probably figured out how to sign his name, but that's not the same as reading and writing. And then he points out that he actually had quite a bit of land by the time he died. And as somebody pointed out, that's because a lot of black families purchased property in order to avoid sharecropping, especially in a racist, white-dominated society. And that didn't undercut the fact that, as I think Tim Scott has pointed out so many times, we went from cotton to Congress in 2 generations. I think it's a very encouraging story. And nevertheless, even though some days you got to appreciate Glenn Kessler, who gave 4 Pinocchios to Joe Biden the other day, this one was not a very good fact check. And I thought, if nothing else, in case you wondered about that, and in case you wonder how the commentators are going to attack Tim Scott when he gives the Republican address on Wednesday, you could actually read that on the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank